In another video, I talked about how to use the commands that you create. And you may have noticed that instead of passing along an actual command, I passed along a factory. And so I wanted to talk about why that is. In this scenario, often, I already said commands are transient, and they are created, used, and discarded. And oftentimes, you may need to perform whatever the task does multiple times. And since I use a dependency injector, in fact, I use Typhoon, which is a really nice dependency injection library for iOS, Objective-C, and Swift. I created a component called a factory, which simply is responsible for using the dependency injector to pull an instance every time I need it. So instead of injecting the task or the command itself, I inject a factory. And if we look at the implementation here in the query champions, every time I need it, I will use the factory to create it. So here, when the view loads, I of course need it. I query the champions so that I can display them. But if the data changes, I'm observing that, and I'm not going to go into that really, other than to say that down here, when the data changes, this method gets called, and I simply query the champions again. So it's possible that I will use that task numerous times, and that's why I inject the factory, so that each time I need to execute the task, it will give me a brand new task. I'll populate the properties as needed, and I will invoke it. Let's have a closer look at the task factory. So if I go to the core module and I look at the task folder here, you'll see that I define a task factory, and it's just a protocol which declares that any task factory implementation must declare a method called create task with type, and it returns an NIO task, which is also a protocol. So I have a Typhoon specific implementation of that, which is masked from the application. So everywhere that I inject the factory, I inject the type as a task factory, not as a Typhoon task factory. And so this is where it ties in with Typhoon. A Typhoon component factory is a Typhoon class, and it gets created by the Typhoon assembly. Here, I'll show you that in a second as well. But all it really does is when it asks for a task, it goes to the Typhoon class and just says, this is an existing method component for type. So it works really nicely. I create this wrapper around a Typhoon class. I make it look like it's specific to creating tasks, but this is a generic method that Typhoon supports for the factory, and you can actually ask it to create a component of any type. So if I look back here at the actual assembly, I have a task factory declaration down here, and it simply creates an instance of the Typhoon task factory, and it injects itself. It injects the assembly itself, which is a Typhoon subclass that has the ability to return instances of anything, any component declared. So let's go back to the app module and look at the application assembly. And this is true of all tasks. So I have one task declared here, and the scope is prototype. What that means is that every time I execute the get task with type method on the factory, it will create a brand new query task. It'll create it, inject it with its dependencies. Here I need the content resolver. So in the view controller, when I ask for the query task from the factory, it will hand me a new query task already containing its content resolver dependency, and it's ready to use as long as I set its properties.